everybody. We'll be starting our next panel momentarily. My name is Kelly Vlahos. I'm the executive editor at the American Conservative. I've been the one putting out all of the blobby tweets for the last 2 months, and I'm really glad to see everybody here. This really is the conference of my dreams, and I don't say that lightly. We're talking about some concepts here that I know that privately and in our own conversations and on our website we've been talking about for some time, but it's great to air some of these issues. And thank you, Andy, for that wonderful discussion. Perfectly teed everything off. So I am going to introduce our moderator for the next panel. Realism versus Washington power, why the blob persists. Will Ruger is Vice President for Research and Policy at the Charles Koch Institute and a research fellow in foreign policy studies at the Cato Institute. He's a U.S. naval officer and an Afghanistan veteran. He previously taught political science at Texas State University and the University of Texas, Austin. I know, Will, that we have talked about this issue about the blob and how it persists, and lamenting why we can't take it to the next level. How do we loosen that stranglehold that the establishment has on Washington? So I'm really looking forward to the panel. Thanks.
Great, and I'll stay seated here. Thank you everyone for coming. I think this is an exciting time to be engaged in the foreign policy discussion. I don't think it's wrong to say that in some ways realism and restraint are hot topics. Particularly given that President Trump, who's perhaps an imperfect vessel for this, has opened up the conversation in Washington, and for that he should be applauded. And hopefully we'll see more carry through in the years ahead. But it's really exciting because I think there's an opportunity for realists and restrainers to really try to provide arguments that can be actionable by policy champions and that can be appealing to the American public, that can kind of fill in some of the gaps in the arguments that are made in the public sphere, to basically find ways to crack open the conversation here. And I'm delighted to share the stage with 4 people who can be contributors to that cracking open of the conversation. So let me introduce those to you. On my far left, which is rarely said about Andy Bacevich, is Andy, and he needs no introduction. And thank you, Andy, for your comments just now. Those were delightful. Next to him is Damon Linker, a columnist with The Week, and also a editor at Penn Press. And I will say someone who I've been talking about this issue since, 1997. And that's pretty exciting to be on the same panel with Damon, given our long discussions. You'll have to stop us from indulging those same things we've been fighting about and arguing about for years. Next to Damon is Monica Duffy Toft, who is a professor at the Fletcher School at Tufts University, and a fantastic academic who's working on this military intervention project that I think will have a big impact. And then to my immediate left, Michael Desch from the Notre Dame International Security Center, where he's a professor and heads up that center, and is also someone who's been in the trenches of realism and restraint for a long time. So without much further ado, I wanted to just start by asking Mike, what is really meant by the blob? I mean, this is a term that Ben Rhodes, one of Obama's national security advisors, used to describe the foreign policy establishment. And in some ways, you could just say, well, it's the foreign policy establishment. But what is usually meant by that? And then what does it stand for?
So the blob is a interesting euphemism or analogy. I guess I didn't pay for this microphone. The blob is an interesting euphemism or analogy. And I think there are really 2 elements about it that resonate in terms of, those of us who are sort of unhappy with establishment policies. One is it tends to be sort of amorphous. It's really hard to pin down. You grab it on one end and it sort of squishes away on the other end. And so the blob analogy, sort of works very well with that. Secondly, blobs tend to be gooey and sticky. They tend to be very, very hard to change. And in fact, I think when Ben Rhodes, who was, started out as Obama's deputy national security advisor, he was sort of using that as a pejorative metaphor for how hard it was to implement meaningful change, within the permanent government and the sort of consensus foreign policy establishment. Now, do you want me to say why I think it exists?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. You have Steve Walt's book up here, The Hell of Good Intentions. I should just wave it around and then shut up about it. But I'll just make 4 really quick points. Steve's argument, I think, is largely, if not exclusively, organizational self-interest. And anybody that's read Graham Allison or any of the bureaucratic politics literature will understand how bureaucratic pathologies or normal bureaucratic processes can lead to bureaucratic pathologies. Bureaucracies don't like to change. They like standard operating procedures. They like lots of resources. They like autonomy. And the consensus American post-Cold War grand strategy of primacy is a perfect recipe for organizational prosperity. Second is inertia. Inertia is a powerful force, in part linked to bureaucratic politics, but I think also it has a sort of broader and superficial historical appeal. And in the debate about NATO, for example, the continuing relevance of NATO, and should NATO be reformed in some way, or should America's role in it change, the argument is often made that this was one of the institutions that helped win the Cold War. Why would we want to mess with it? And there's a superficially appealing logic to that, although when you scratch it a little bit deeper and say, Cold War's over, it's won, it's a different environment. But that's a more complicated argument, but that certainly is out there. The third thing is, and Andy alluded to this in his remarks, but I'd put a little bit more of a fine point on it. The dominant ideology of the vital center of the United States is what Louis Hartz calls our liberal tradition. And the irony of our liberal tradition, you think liberals are squishy and comme ci, comme ça, but in fact, as Hartz shows, liberalism, at least in the American context, has some powerful rigidity behind it. And particularly in the area of foreign policy, liberalism is a set of blinders that has led the United States historically, but especially since '93, to overemphasize the threats that we face from non-liberal currents and actors, and to also underplay the difficulty of remaking the world in our image. So the end of history appealed to a lot of liberals because it was what they saw as the natural teleology of political development. The final point I would make is Adam Smith famously said, I think, of states that they have lots of ruin in them. And the United States is a large and powerful state, and we have lots of ruin in us, which means we can do a lot of dumb things, and it's going to take a while for the chickens to come home to roost. And that, I think, works to the blob's advantage as well.
Monica, do you want to add anything about these questions about what it is meant by the blob and what does it stand for?
Sure. Is this on?
There you go.
Mine's not working? I think mine's not working.
I didn't turn mine off.
Oh.
That's why it's not
All right,
working.
so maybe it's, okay, maybe it's on. Yeah, there it is. So I would agree. So how I think about it is 3 I's, and Mike's already touched upon the first, which is the inertia, right? This amorphous, shapeless object is how it's defined, which is sort of the Washington blob. But there's 2 others, which hasn't been touched upon, which is the American polity. And I think the other 2 I's are ignorance and indifference. And, Eisenhower, in his farewell address to the Americans in 1961, said only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals so that security and liberty may prosper together. And what's tragic about that is today, I think we can all agree in this room that one of the biggest threats to the country is North Korea, and 2/3 of Americans cannot identify where North Korea is on a map. They're given a map of Asia, and they're plunking it all the way from Russia to North Korea itself, but 2/3 of Americans, and it turns out that those Americans who could identify where North Korea was, or is, it hasn't gone anywhere, support diplomacy over military force. And so if you're educated, if you know about foreign policy, you have a better sense of what can be done and the other tools of statecraft other than military intervention. So that's one I think is just ignorance, and I also think that most Americans do not appreciate and have a keen sense of American history and the use of force in American history. And so one of the things, Will, you already mentioned the Military Intervention Project, what we're trying to do is just show how bullish, how much of a bully the United States has been and has become more so in the post-Cold War era. And I'll go into that a little bit later when I present some of the data. And so another political scientist, Philip Converse, said, the simplest truths I know about is the distribution of political information in moderate electrics are the mean is low and the variance is high. And what I would say is when it comes to foreign policy and national security policy, the information is probably even lower, right? It's held only by a few, and the variance is even higher. Again, it's held by, so that's ignorance. The second is indifference. We know this, right? We're now coming into another election year, although we never got out of one. And most Americans don't, first of all, care about politics. And when they care about politics, they care about economics. Right, and so foreign policy and national security is often down, way down on the totem pole when it comes to policy issues. And in fact, if you look at Gallup data, more people care about poor government and leadership today. Currently, 1 in 3 Americans, that is the highest on their priority. That's good news, because if we can get better leadership and better governance, perhaps we can, work on this issue. The second issue was immigration, and interestingly, they had to lump together a whole array of economic issues to get it up to 11%. Foreign policy, national security doesn't even make it into the top 20 issues of the most recent Gallup polls. And then the other thing is, Andy, I like your point about this American exceptionalism, but actually when you look at polls of American citizens, they don't think we need to be exceptional. They think we need to play a major role. So most Americans think, yes, the United States needs to be engaged. It's in our national interests. But they don't think we should take the leading role. So only 23% of Americans think we should be taking the leading role. 49% think we should be taking a major role. And only 23% think we should be taking a minor role. There's room there then for sort of educating the public about what we're doing and how we're doing it. And so I'm going to stop there. So I think the 3 I's is inertia, and that this information that we have about national security, what the United States has been doing, is held by this blob. And they push it, right? But related to that is the American public is not pushing back. And I think, again, the twofold is the ignorance. And then lastly, the second is that indifference. They're just not attuned to what's happening in the same way that they should be, given the stakes that we have.
Yeah, I mean, and I think when we're talking about the blob, we're talking about elites as cue givers that tell the American public what they ought to think about the nature of the world. And the problem is that the foreign policy establishment is unified in what that role ought to be. And I've often talked about how the debate in Washington is between the 48-yard lines, and other voices are not as prominent. Now, I think that is changing. Like I said when I started, restraint, realism, these are hot topics. And I think that we're starting to see that break open. Damon, you come from the journalistic world, or you're in the journalistic world, and I recommend everyone read his columns on foreign policy because they're very insightful and sharp. But Damon, from your view as a journalist, how does the blob instantiate itself in the elite levels of journalism? And what are you seeing in the future in terms of those particular types of cue givers in journalism and how they can actually challenge that status quo approach?
Well, I mean, before I get to the journalism aspect of it, I have to define how I understand what the blob is,
Sure.
which is slightly different than what has been emphasized so far, although Andy spoke in these terms near the beginning of his remarks. Whenever I think about the blob, I tend to remember G.K. Chesterton's line about how America is a nation with the soul of a church, but I'd like to tweak that to suggest that perhaps we're a church in the form of a nation. We, as a country, going all the way back to Puritan landfall in New England, all those centuries ago, down to today, I think we have tended to view the country as a kind of project, a theological project that has political correlates to them. They have to do with basically two main things: that we are appointed by God to be his kind of leading edge of providence in the world through the spreading of democracy, and in more recent decades, spreading of human rights around the world, that we are ordained by God to do this. And then the second point of this is that if we don't do it, if we act in the world, say in terms of our interests, what's good for the country in a narrower sense, that this is a threat and it inspires a kind of anxiety that God will then withdraw his protection from us because we're failing in our divinely ordained mission. This is a kind of outlook on the world that I think echoes throughout American history in various ways. When many people in this room like to quote, say, George Washington's farewell address or John Quincy Adams on going abroad in search of monsters to destroy, or Dwight Eisenhower's farewell address, we have to remind ourselves, what were these people arguing against? What were they pushing back against? And what they were trying to argue against, or perhaps even just moderate or temper, is this kind of theological outlook of the country and its role in the world that I do think we have to kind of put at the center of what's motivating a lot of what we describe as the blob. So then if this is, whether it's a metaphor or an analogy or not, what is the blob in these theological terms? These are the ministers and missionaries of our theological project as a country. And then to bring it back to the question about journalism, journalists are, I don't know, deacons, whatever the analogy would be. It is astonishing how often people who write about national security, foreign policy in the journalistic world sort of restrain themselves about being too critical about war, starting wars, fighting wars, choosing where we send troops, how long troops should remain in a theater of conflict, in terms of a fear that they will be undercutting some great moral project that the United States is engaged with, so that it's somehow irresponsible to raise critical questions about what we're doing, what interests are we advancing, that somehow this is insufficiently moral as an outlook on the world and how America should conduct itself in the world. And the other strange thing that is somewhat odd if you step back and look at it for journalists, that often when you view the world in these theological terms, you end up, because it is a faith, really, in the end, it is immune to empirical refutation. So if you say, well, we've been at war in Afghanistan for 18 years now, what is the evidence that we're actually approaching any terminus that could be described as success? And there's a kind of blank stare that then faces you. Well, but But if we withdraw, won't bad things happen? Won't democracy and the few gains that we are somehow overseeing and making possible by having troops keeping order there, if we stop keeping order, things will get bad, and then somehow this will be our fault and we'll be bad as a country, and then some amorphous feeling that this badness of us will be punished, that somehow other bad things will happen. Terrorists will crop back up. There'll be another 9/11, a new Osama bin Laden, the Taliban will be back in charge. This anxiety, which I spoke of, is again part of this kind of theological outlook. So that's what's, I think, strange, and I think it's salutary for those of us who are trying to sort of change direction a little bit, to think about how difficult it is and why it seems why it's a blob, because you can't grab hold of it. It's sort of in the air. It is very much so, I think, our civil religion in this country, and trying to change that is trying to change something very big about the country.
Yeah. Andy, you've spanned a career that has gone from West Point to the classrooms. What is the relationship of say the military to the blob, and of a kind of the new American militarism, as you've put it in your fantastic book? How does that relate to the blob, and is it supportive? Is it a problem for the blob? How would you assess the military? And then from your perspective as an academic, Eisenhower talked about the military industrial congressional research complex, and then it was shortened. How do academics either contribute to or are a challenge to the blob?
Well, the military is an instrument of the state, and I think one of the very things we should be proud of is the commitment of the officer corps to remaining apolitical. They don't make policy, they implement policy, even at the highest levels. Those 4 stars that I referred to very briefly advise, they recommend. They're not in a position to make fundamental decisions. And all that is to the good. That said, and this gets to the bureaucratic politics part, I guess, as an institution, the armed forces are deeply invested in maintaining the status quo. The big budget, the prominence that the military instrument has in the world of policy. And so there too, they're not particularly inclined to think critically about whether or not our military posture, our military policies are actually serving the interests of the country. There too, there's a pyramid. If you want to get to be up, you want to end up being a 4-star, well, you don't begin by saying maybe a posture of global power projection isn't good for us, So there is a dearth of critical thinking there. I'd add one more thing, and this gets back to the theology of American exceptionalism. When Trump made his decision, 5 weeks ago now, to pull out of Syria right now, and of course that elicited a broad bipartisan pushback from the blob, And Mitch McConnell, of all people, published an op-ed in the Washington Post in which McConnell, expressing his dissent from any pullback from Syria, made an argument about the post-war tradition of American statecraft, which even if the Cold War ended 30 years ago, where we're supposed to adhere to that tradition now and forever. And in the course of making that argument, he used the phrase indispensable nation, at which time I knocked my coffee cup off of my desk. Because, of course, that phrase that will live forever in the history of American statecraft was coined by Madeleine Albright, embraced by Bill Clinton of the hated Democratic Party. And I took McConnell's appropriation of that phrase and at this particular moment as one very powerful expression of this conviction that we are indeed called upon to lead, as they would like to say, and to shape the future of the world. And the fact that conditions have changed from 1945 to 1989 to 2019 is frankly irrelevant. That we are indeed and will always be the indispensable nation, and we demonstrate that indispensability through the exercise of what the Blob likes to call global leadership, which implicitly means accruing and being prepared to use and using military power. So these notions are exceedingly deep-seated. I don't dispute the data that Monica was giving us, and I'm guessing back in Indiana, where I first came from, people are not particularly concerned about pacifying Afghanistan. But the closer you get to elite circles, it seems to me, the more the theology of American exceptionalism tends to have a controlling influence.
Yeah, I want to kind of touch back on this elite mass distinction. When we talk about the military, we oftentimes are thinking about the Pentagon officials, right? The guys with the stars on their collars and the women with the stars on their collars. But we've seen polling recently that shows that veterans as a whole are not excited about what the United States has been doing over the last 20 to 30 years, that they think that what the United States has been doing isn't necessarily making us safer or making the world a better place. And in fact, I think a supermajority would be supportive of President Trump if he withdrew from Afghanistan in some polling I've seen. And then just on Sunday, the New York Times ran a piece on the front page talking about the intensity of veteran groups and veterans in wanting to end these endless wars. But you don't really see that among the brass, right? You see retired officials having, kind of bedwetting episodes when Trump threatens to change some of our commitments abroad. You see admirals and generals writing op-eds just on the heels of their retirement, really trying to push in the policy space. So this gets to my question of how is the foreign policy establishment sustained? Is it by a process by which these elites replicate themselves, condition the incentives for improvement or for career opportunities such that you have to kowtow to these ideas? What is it about this that sustains itself? Or is it simply kind of naked self-interest about, you don't want to hurt your opportunity to get a job with Boeing if you say something against this? Or is it really what I think is probably most important, was a kind of shared set of mindsets that have been inculcated over time, or is it a bunch of those? In other words, what is sustaining this, not only in the military at the highest ranks, but among other elites? Mike?
So I want to, focus on the narrow military and veterans piece and let my colleagues, talk about the larger issue. I mean, I think Monica is absolutely right. There's, at the public level, at the mass level, a pretty high level of indifference in general about foreign policy and national security issues. And I think that's, in part, rational ignorance theory can explain that. I also think Andy's point about, one of the unintended downsides of the transition from conscription to the all-volunteer force is a part of that story as well. And I think we've really got to wrestle with that. But I think the one exception is supporting the troops. I teach at the University of Notre Dame. We used to play football there. We still have the sacred ritual 6 times on Saturday afternoons that always include some sort of military event. Last weekend was an F-16 flyover. And I tell you, you see 85,000 people viscerally come together in support of the troops, even if only momentarily, because then the flyover is about 30 seconds, and then get the hell out of there. Let's play the game. But I think that emphasizing the importance, well, first of all, the costs of our endless wars on the troops is a very important moral point in my view, but also one that I think is a wedge issue with the broader American public. And as much as we can message that being careful about when we use military force is the most effective thing we can do to support the troops, the more we're going to break through into public opinion on this issue.
Yeah, Monica, Damon, and Andy, just jump in as you see fit. How does the blob sustain itself? I mean, why is it still so powerful, despite the fact that over the last 20 to 30 years, American foreign policy just hasn't been working at making us safer or more prosperous? Monica?
I think it's money. I mean, I think a lot of it is money interests. This is why we go back to the military-industrial complex, which there's also the military-industrial congressional complex, right? So we know that lobbying helps. Defense industry is very, very strong, and it's hard to lobby for more diplomats. Look, I teach at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. It was established in 1933, right after the Great Depression, by very insightful people that thought, we do not want another world war. We better teach diplomacy. But I have to say, even in our School of Law and Diplomacy, the International Security Studies program is so much stronger because there's a lot more money to fund it. Kids are interested in it, right? It's, you have to admit, studying military and shrapnel and how things blow up is kind of cool, right? Whereas diplomacy, it takes a really long time to master it. You've got to learn cultures, you've got to learn languages, you've got to learn values, right? And so when you ask how is it perpetuated, I actually think in educational institutions, Andy's begging for money for the Quincy Institute. I'd love for some people to...
Begging.
I'm
Encouraging
going
people to
beg.
consider.
I'm going to beg. I wish that we would endow some chairs in diplomacy, right? And teach people about the diplomatic arts, which are being lost in this country, which I think is part of, and we're seeing this also reflected in the State Department. Now, the State Department, who is defending the State Department? And paradoxically, actually, it's the military. It's DOD saying, if you're going to give me fewer diplomats, I'm going to need more weapon systems. And so I think interests and money are a big part of this.
Yeah, I want to kind of challenge you a little bit, because if my friends in the foreign policy establishment were here, I think they would push back on this notion that it's really about kind of filthy lucre, right? That it's about money, and even that it's about, say, a military-industrial congressional research complex. I think they might say that, look, these are important ideas that reflect America's interests and what they consider to be the best way to secure them in the world that we live in. I think that's a shared set of mindsets. Now, it's not a mutually exclusive argument from interest-based ones, but again, Damon, you're an ideas guy. You come from a background of political theory. What is it about this mindset that is so powerful to people here? What is the nature of that mindset? I mean, you say it's religious, but is there something more than that? I mean, are there assumptions about the nature of the world that they make that are at least legitimate but might be wrong in our view? Or
Oh, sure. I mean, Well, there are several layers of it. There's the kind of deep, what I call theological layer, but then there's also the one that Andy's mentioned a few times now about how this works in the military, that you don't rise up to be a senior person in the military if you express skepticism about our military posture around the world and the need to project force throughout the world and keep military bases in many, many places and so forth. But similarly in journalism, that if you want to be a journalist covering Washington, you need sources. You need people in the Pentagon and the State Department and in the White House and in Congress who will talk to you. And if you start writing things that are critical in a more fulsome way of our foreign policy stance, the people in power won't talk to you. And so if you want to cultivate sources in the Pentagon, you have to show that the person who talks to you won't end up disagreeing with how you use the quote. And I've seen that many times, that people, it's a kind of culture that reinforces and reproduces itself in the sense of gaining access and opening doors to power. This is a town about power and access and who you know and the connections you have. And so kind of sociologically, that's very important. And then there's also a kind of, along with that, a kind of default sense that if you're too critical of the power projection and primacy presumptions of this town, that you're somehow not being responsible. That this is, you don't understand that the world does need us. We are the indispensable nation. We're the linchpin of world peace, the liberal international order. And if you criticize it too much, you're not being a grown up. You're not realizing that that really, to be responsible, you need to carry this burden of sort of peacekeeping throughout the world. Which, sure, we have to fight war after war to keep the peace, but that's a paradox we won't emphasize too much.
Yeah. So, Andy,
Can I pile on that?
Yeah, please.
Because it's not simply that we're not being responsible. It is that we are committing the most grievous of sins, and that is succumbing to isolationism. And my point here is that I think hovering in the background to all of this is an interpretation of American history. And it is a false, oversimplified interpretation of American history that stems from a deep-seated conviction that the only alternative to American global leadership is utterly irresponsible, turn your back on the world isolationism. Where does this come from? I think it comes from the continuing importance of World War II in our understanding of world history and our understanding of our history. Mm-hmm. And the essence of what we remember about World War II really is concentrated in that period between roughly 1938 and December 7th, 1941, when the country was deeply divided about whether or not to intervene in the European war, and when those who opposed intervention were labeled as isolationists, and those people lost that argument. Now, they lost that argument. It was good that they lost that argument because Nazi Germany did pose a threat to us and to the rest of the world that required a forceful response. But that moment in history then created this bludgeon of isolationism that whenever somebody seems to criticize the imperative of us fulfilling our theological responsibility, well, then you must be an isolationist. You must be a de facto apologist for totalitarianism. You must be somebody who welcomes a repetition of the Holocaust. And now I'm overstating it, but it seems to me that that is very much a part of the part of the consciousness that sustains the blob. I think we saw that in the Syria episode. Once the president announces, and I'm not defending for a second his announcement of we're pulling out of Syria day after tomorrow, but the response was, well, genocide is now going to ensue. All the Kurds are going to be murdered, and we're going to be guilty. So there is this overhang of World War II. That somehow that moment captured the essence of history. There's a source of the lessons that must be honored that I think helps to sustain the blob and to therefore narrow any kind of conversation or debate about foreign policy.
Yeah, I mean, I'm the I word and its use is a kind of scoundrel's move, if you will. What I think is a good segue to the next part of our conversation here about what must be done is that after World War II, in fact, even before that, after World War I, you saw a concerted effort by liberal internationalists to build institutions and to sustain narratives to push back against us ever returning to the kind of Washingtonian approach that we followed for the first 150 years of our country's history. So you have the development of councils around the country, things like the Council on Foreign Relations. You have the rise of a kind of an official narrative that is promoted through historians. And then you had, of course, as you know well, Andy, a kind of revisionist approach, the Wisconsin school, that pushed back on that. But the fact is there was a set of ideas and institutions that were developed to sustain American liberal hegemony over time. So my question is, if realism and restraint is going to succeed as a new approach, a new consensus, but perhaps, what must be done to do this? And what can we learn from actually what those liberal hegemonialists have done over the last 70 years or more? And I think, Andy, I'm going to start with you because Quincy is part, I think, of that effort to build institutions and to sustain ideas in the public conversation that can hopefully achieve a new consensus that could be left, right, conservative, progressive, et cetera.
I don't think I have a good answer for you because I'm too old. I mean, I certainly would say that, yes, the Quincy Institute intends to be part of a project that's going to bring about change. But one of the things I'm struck, and this is why I don't have anything useful to say, is I am not, I don't have much of an aptitude with the new modes of communication and therefore of influencing opinion. You know, I write an occasional book, I write an occasional op-ed, I do an occasional book review, meaning that my activities are the sort of activities that one would pursue if you wanted to bring about change back in 1934. As my Quincy Institute colleagues know, I don't even have a smartphone. You know, I don't do social media. I don't like all that stuff. But I acknowledge that there needs to be communication strategies that are in tune with our times if we're going to bring about the sort of change that that needs to happen. That's a big, huge question that I'm not able to comment on other than simply acknowledging that the old approaches to both informing the public and trying to bring about change in the attitudes of the public, the old approaches don't work anymore.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think Quincy is going to be an important part of a realism and restraint counter-elite. that I think needs to be transpartisan and needs to assemble the types of ideas that can be appealing to the American public and that policy champions can promote. So I applaud your efforts to try to help Quincy get off the ground. Mike, you work at the Notre Dame International Security Center, which is a producer of fundamental ideas about the nature of the world and how America can secure itself in that world. What role do you play and does your work play in helping, I think, reset American foreign policy?
Well, I think what we try to do at NDISC and, what Monica tries to do at Tufts and Andy when he still worked for a living, did at BU, is two things. One is to, provide the intellectual infrastructure for a broader view of U.S. grand strategic options, whether it's a deeper view of history or a wider range of discussion about what are the options that are best for the situation for the United States in the 21st century. We're also, especially at NDIS, trying to, build the bench of the next generation of national security policymakers and unencumber them with the legacy of previous ways of doing U.S. national security business that hopefully will make them, more open to new approaches in the future. I have to say, I'm, cautiously optimistic about the younger generation. I almost never say this because I'm a curmudgeonly old professor and a Burkean conservative, and I always think youth is wasted on the young. But Will and I were at this seminar in Chicago Tuesday night that the National Review Institute organized. It's basically mid-career level people, mostly lawyers and bankers and folks of that background. The topic was foreign policy, and I went into it thinking we were going to be swimming against the, the pro-empire tide. But really, almost unprompted, my sense, I don't know if Will shares this, but going around the table, it was very clear that these folks were very sympathetic to the sort of critiques of American post-Cold War grand strategy that have been featured in the pages of TAC or in Andy's books or other venues like that. Now, to go to the issue of Quincy and what Will characterized as, building a new consensus around restraint, I can't endorse that strongly enough. I think as long as restraint is dismissed as being sort of marginal, whether on the left or on the right, it's not going to have any traction. And the question is how we do that. Who is going to be our Nixon who goes to China? Somebody, an establishment political figure or series of political figures that at some point are going to say enough is enough. I worry a little bit that we've got a lot of Moseses in the, or Moseses?
Yep.
In the restraint community, but remember our scripture, Andy. Moses he saw, but he never got to the promised land. And I think if we don't crack the vital center, that we're not going to get to the promised land either.
Yeah, Monica and Damon, I mean, what would you like to add to kind of how we can accomplish, kind of realism and restraint in our lifetime?
You can go ahead.
I can tell you what I'm doing, and I'm hoping it's having an effect. I've been in the business for 20 years, and I started out at the Olin Institute, which was Sam Huntington's outfit. And actually, he had the idea that he was quite concerned that there wasn't expertise in forming U.S. national security policy. And it turns out Mike and I were both assistant directors of that institute. And there is a network of us that's involved in sort of thinking about national security policy, and more importantly, effectively communicating it to a broader audience. And so if you were an Olin fellow, fellow, that was the expectation, that you produce policy relevant research, which in the academy is not the case across the board. So I think that's one is, I've always taught at schools of public policy, and I think it's extraordinarily important for our students to effectively communicate the ideas that they're learning. Second is, silly me, I still believe in data and facts, and so that's why I'm pulling together this data set on all military interventions from the United States in 1776. There's been over 500. A quarter of them have happened since the end of the Cold War. Think about that. In the last 19 years, a quarter of them have happened at a time when the United States is not facing an existential threat. I'm sorry, the Cold War is an existential threat. We are not facing an existential threat. And I think that those kinds of facts really sort of sharpen the mind to think about, why are we doing this? Because for me, Andy, I love your discussion about isolationism coming out of the 1930s. But for me, the question is why we moved from sort of having to be engaged to the use of force, right? What happened to diplomacy? What happened to trade? What happened to the other tools of statecraft? Why does it have to be the use of force? And if you look at the more contemporary era, in the old days, the United States used to use displays of force. We'd send in a ship. Canada was a real pain in the neck to us. We'd send in a ship, and that would de-escalate the crisis. Then it became the threat of the use of force. And now we actually use force. And what's happening really strikingly in the current era is that our opponents are less likely to use force, and we're more likely. So we're not only more engaged, well, we're more engaged hostilely. And most Americans, and I think most policymakers, are not aware of that. And I think once they see the data and we put it in front of them, that we are actually using force, the intensity of our engagement is much graver, then perhaps that will help them to see that maybe we should rethink this, and maybe, talk with the people at the Quincy Institute, talk with Mike's students at Notre Dame and my students at the Fletcher School, both on the international security side, but then also on the diplomacy side.
Let me ask Monica a question on that. When you cite the greater frequency of intervention, it's not a secret, but it's a fact that doesn't seem to resonate. So or maybe I'm mistaken in saying that, but if I'm not, what can we do in calling attention to this change pattern of behavior to get people to say, whoa, that's really important?
Because I think I think some policymakers are aware of it. I don't think that they understand the depth of it. So what we're trying to do is show not only the frequency, I think most people recognize that, Andy, but what they don't realize is that we're resorting to higher levels of violence than we've ever had in the past. They're not aware of that. Right, that escalatory ladder is much quicker, at a time when our opponents are not. So they're not following us up. So there's a disjunct there. If our enemies, our opponents aren't doing it, why are we doing it? And so I'm hoping, maybe I'm too much of a perennial optimist, that it's the combination of these facts and really great graphics that you can put in front of people to say, really, this is extraordinarily dangerous. The same on the diplomacy side. There's been a 1,400% increase in political appointee donations to presidents under Trump. And he's increased political appointees in the State Department. Again, those kinds of figures, right? And so thinking about, Ryan Scoville at Marquette University has done great research on this, thinking about, okay, how do we pull out the politics out of our State Department so that we can re-represent national interests and have an effective diplomatic corps, which is now suffering.
I mean, Monica, I love the idea, I think ideas matter, and they provide the kind of framework in which other elites swim, right, or operate. But it's not as if the State Department over the last 30 years has been a bastion of restraint thinking. I mean, we're mucking around in Ukraine. We're engaged in all kinds of primacist aspects short of using force that actually set the table for, I think, this notion of being an indispensable nation, of the importance of ultimately having to use power and force to achieve outcomes in other places that aren't necessary, right? So if you told me we should use diplomacy to kind of sort out like the politics of northeastern Syria, I think a restrainer might say, Well, why? Sure, we could offer that if it's in our interest, but we really shouldn't be engaged in a situation in which we're trying to pick winners and losers, even diplomatically, because ultimately engaging in some ways like that can then lead you down those paths. I mean, remember in Somalia, our mission there was just to help provide food security.
That's right.
And then we ended up picking winners and losers in politics, and then we ended up using force to make that happen in a real way. So I would just caution against the notion that, yes, diplomacy is important, but it's a mindset about how diplomacy ought to be used that is going to be important to how the future of the State Department goes.
No, and I agree with that, but what I would say is, so even in Somalia, I think had we had a better sense of what was happening on the ground, we may not have gone after the tribal chiefs, right? So just stayed committed, perhaps, to that humanitarian effort. But this hubris that we've been talking about, this American exceptionalism's indispensable nation, where the diplomats, not all diplomats, advocate for the use of force. Yes, Madeleine Albright in Yugoslavia said to Powell, why aren't we using this? Why aren't we engaging this? But a true diplomat, actually, force is absolutely the last means of trying to achieve your national interest.
Right.
Right?
Yep.
Trying to achieve your national interest, not trying to defeat an enemy, and we're forgetting that.
Right. But again, the national interest in a realism and restraint world is very narrow, right? It's to keep us safe, our territorial integrity, and to promote the conditions of our prosperity. And a lot of what you see is the old joke about the State Department is the representative of other countries to the United States, right? That's not the real approach that we want the State Department to have. We want it to be about safety and prosperity.
That's right, and advancing U.S. national interests first and foremost. And,
Right.
and the problem is that they're secondary. I mean, you think about Bolton's yellow pad in Venezuela, and remember what he had written on there? 5,000 troops to Colombia. Knee-jerk reaction, send in the troops.
Right.
And so I think if you have a proper diplomatic corps that's engaged and allowed to be engaged in the way that is securing U.S. national interests and funded to be able to do that, right, then we may not get in these crises. We may not have to get involved in any of these sort of things that sort of dissipate our power, dissipate our reputation to the point where we're now, spending, $643 billion on the Defense Department.
Mike?
Just very quickly, I think Monica's instinct is the right thing for two reasons. First of all, if we're doing diplomacy and we're regarding diplomacy as an important tool of statecraft, which I think it'll become and should become increasingly important in the 21st century, that's an alternative to doing what we've been doing over the last quarter of the century. And so as an alternative, yeah, you're right. We want to also be modest about what we expect diplomacy can do. But I think it's important to, to have the diplomatic instrument as an important part of the toolbox. Secondly, we got a big problem with restraint, and that's that a lot of people who do not like restraint are dismissing it as isolationism. I don't think it's isolationism. I think it's a different form of international engagement. And diplomacy is, it seems to me, along with trade, a good way to say, hey, we're not Charles Lindbergh, we're not Colonel McCormick. We believe in an America engaged around the world, but engaged in a different sort of way. And I think diplomacy has got to be part of that.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's no doubt about that. I mean, you heard me say the other night that I think actually realism and restraint is the kind of true internationalism. It's trying to engage the world in a mutually beneficial way, in a way that's helpful for us and helpful for others because it's positive sum. And that's why I think the kind of focus on trade. And I think oftentimes when we talk about diplomacy, we miss the fact that it's also civil society groups that are American-based engaging the world in a productive fashion. It's not just public diplomacy that can be part of our toolkit for America and securing American interests and values. So with that, I want to move to some questions here. We're going to follow the Jeopardy rule, okay? So please ask your question in the form of a question. I'm going to sick Andy on you if you go on too long, because he's been the best person at moderating this. In the back, please. Yeah. Yeah, and you can form a line at the podium, please.
This question's for Andy most of all, but others too. There's sort of a triangular thing of the blob and the respectable realism and restraint community, which stretches from, say, the Wisconsin School to Quincy Institute. But there's also the most loudest advocate is Donald Trump for realism and restraint, even though he's like not very good at it. And I know Andy has no great admiration for the president, but I just would like to know how he thinks about this triangular relationship, since the blob is probably Trump's most effective opponent and is likely to, or quite possibly can bring him down.
Maybe collectively.
Well, I don't take the president very seriously as a statesman. I've never met the man. All I know is what I read in the papers. It does seem to me that I see no evidence that he subscribes to any coherent set of fixed principles. He has certain urges. We see those urges when it comes to trade. We see those urges in his determination to roll back the legacy of his predecessor. And we see those urges when it comes to war and his repeated statement that he wishes to see an end to endless war. Now, I'm 100% in agreement with that sentiment, but I just don't think that the president himself has any serious notion of how to bring that about. And I think the Syria case is a good illustration. When he announced he was going to withdraw was it December of 2018, he made that announcement. The blob pushes back, so essentially nothing happens. And then he announces a few weeks ago, I'm pulling out of Syria. Blob pushes back. It turns out that troops end up kind of getting moved around more than really withdrawing. So it could be that at some deep level, this is a genuine commitment on his part, but neither he nor the persons that he hires to advise him and implement his policies actually have much of a clue about actually how to bring that about. I mean, you have to have a plan at some point. Here's the 6 things we're going to do over the next 8 weeks to try to bring this about, and here are some things that could go wrong, and here are the 4 things we're going to do to try to respond to the things that it might go wrong. This administration doesn't seem to work that way, and therefore it's very hard to me to take all that seriously, the rhetoric of ending endless war, even though I emphatically agree with that objective.
So we have a lot of people in line and limited time, so I'm going to collect questions. So make your questions short and sweet, and then we'll have the panel tackle these, and hopefully we'll get answers to everybody here. So quick questions, please.
Okay, a quick national security and foreign policy question. What do you think the possible implications of the House Intelligence Committee deciding not to subpoena John Bolton to testify? And the foreign policy question is, who would you replace? Who would be good replacements for Jared Kushner and Stephen Miller in the Trump administration, in light of what the goals of the American conservative, I guess the majority of you up there have?
Okay, next questioner.
So my question to the panel is it perhaps that we've gotten the idea of chain of command wrong, that our obligation is not to follow all laws, orders, but to only follow proper and true orders? And I know that because I practice in this building and over at the Eisenhower, and I have briefed the truth and seen the lie come out of people's mouths. So it's a question of what can we do? Do you agree with it? We have the chain of command wrong, and that we should have more open democracy in the discussion process, just not at the top. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
It seems to me that the realist camp attacks the propaganda of the liberal interventionist camp and doesn't really get to the core crux of their project, which is a Mahanian, Mackinder, Spikeman-based project. And so I'm always curious, why doesn't the realist camp address that as opposed to going after the propaganda?
Okay, great. Thank you.
My question is just clarifying each panelist's position on the blob itself. Is the blob necessary? Do we need a blob, or are we just simply upset with the opinions of the blob? What does the correct size and expertise look like, and how democratic should foreign policy be, or should it be more elite?
Great question. Yeah.
Do you think the blob's antagonistic attitude about Russia and about Orthodox Christian Eastern Europe is based to some extent on ethnic and/or religious prejudice?
Great. And Medea?
It seems like the Trump administration is increasingly using brutal economic sanctions as an alternative to intervention. Can you comment on that?
So why don't we try to take a shot at some of these down the row, and then hopefully we'll get to the next group here. So Mike, quickly.
Yeah, just two real quick things to Andrew, who's a good representative of the NDISC undergraduates at Notre Dame. Look, a bureaucracy, which is, the technical term for the blob, is absolutely essential in a complex organization. So you can't do away with it. I think what most of us argue is to simply understand it's a double-edged sword, and that bureaucracies, whether it's in domestic politics or even universities, become somewhat self-regarding. And so don't take everything they say without a big grain of salt.
Monica?
Just if that one, groupthink, I think the blob, look, you're always going to have a specialized set of elites or experts. You've got a set of experts up here. Just being consciously aware of groupthink, and that's what we're trying to do here, I think, is to sort of break that. And then the others, they're a little too specific for me to respond. But the one about Russia, I study Russia a lot. No, I think it's Russia's behavior. I don't think this has to do with, interests and identities. The United States feels as if Russia is going against its national interests, and so there's some antipathy, some tension about that.
Monica, do you think there's any Russophobia that is a hangover of the Cold War? We still think of the old bad guys as bad guys?
Oh yeah, I think there's still some Cold Warriors around, and so absolutely, I think that for some, the Soviet Union will, that mindset about it being the evil empire will never go away. Look, I'm a Reagan Republican, but I think even in the current era, Russia is trying to use the Orthodox Church to advance its interests, particularly throughout Europe. But if you look at what Putin's trying to do, he's trying to advance Russian interests, not necessarily Orthodox interests. I think it's a way of him extending power for power's sake, not necessarily to advance necessarily the interests of the Orthodox Church.
Damon?
Well, on the issue of the blob, I would just say, as I think Monica and Michael both stated, I think it's quite true. You need elites, you need experts, people who know things about the world. I think the problem is that actually our blob is so fixated on kind of upholding its pieties and kind of moral principles that it often kind of doesn't absorb what it should know and sort of does know. It kind of puts that at a back seat to kind of making moral pronouncements. And so I wouldn't call it a blob ideally. It would be kind of foreign policy elites who probably should have a little bit more disagreement amongst themselves about what our interests are in various theaters around the world and what we should do. And then that would be a more functional foreign policy elite than what we call the blob.
I agree with that. I've always, in my naive sort of view of things, wished that given that we're going to have a two-party system in our country, I always thought it'd be really cool if we had a genuine principled liberal party and a genuine principled conservative party, and they could duke it out, they could make their arguments, and ultimately the American people would, serve as the referee and give power to one side or the other. That's not the system we have, but I think I would say the same thing about these foreign policy elites. Yeah, you're going to have them, and it would be nice if there was one foreign policy elite that agreed with us and adhered to the principles of restraint and prudence. But I'm okay with having another foreign policy elite that makes the argument that we're America and we need to go out there and fix stuff. And that debate could happen and would ultimately resolve itself. And whether or not they would give us necessarily enlightened foreign policy, I don't know, but at least we would not be sort of stuck on one particular course, which seems to be the case now with the blob that we have.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're pointing to is that we don't really have a healthy marketplace of ideas or republic of science right now, and what we need is to broaden the conversation to make sure that that happens, and that doesn't mean that you have to actually, kind of silence other voices out there, and I think that's very liberal of you, Andy, and I think that's the spirit of this panel. A couple more questions here.
Yes, hi. This is both for Andrew and Monica. With return or resurgence, rather, of great power competition with both Russia and now China, how soon can we realistically expect a return to recognizing the importance of both A, strategic thinking and planning, and B, the importance of diplomacy?
Okay, thank you. Next.
Hi, earlier you were talking about the moral aspects of this whole discussion as it relates to veterans and the impact the war has had on them, and then also along those lines, how you're incorporating those voices into your decision-making structures, especially at Quincy Institute. And I'm curious about that same sort of question, but the impacts that we're having on communities abroad, and if those voices are being incorporated, what role you see them having in the movement you're trying to build, and if, especially at Quincy Institute, you're working to incorporate those voices into...
Could you just clarify what you mean by voices abroad?
Yeah, so the communities that have been impacted by U.S. military intervention, like on the ground.
I mean, all the people we bomb and kill?
Correct, yes.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yes.
I'm a former diplomat, and apologies, I'm a Machiavellian blob. I'm nervous when a new organization sets off champagne corks in Russia, China, and even Islamist caves here and there. I think that sends up a huge red flag, or two red flags and one black flag. I want to know if any of you have the courage to name the number of dead bodies you need to justify intervention in human rights situations. A real number. Don't chicken out here.
Okay. Next.
Hi. Is it at all meaningful to compare the regard that the American blob gives to the Middle East with the regard that the bureaucracy of the old British Empire gave to its interest in India?
Okay, great. And real quick, the last two, because we got to move on, and I want to make sure we get a cut at these answers, but quick.
I just make an observation that in many of the activities that we're engaged in abroad, we're not by ourselves. For example, with respect to the Middle East, the UK and France are participating in many of the activities that we are. And also, when you go to Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, those countries, as well as the European Union, are taking what I would describe as a rather aggressive stance that seems of trying to force more countries into NATO and to take at least a very forward, aggressive stance in promoting the kind of a society that we would prefer, rather than allowing the players in the region to work it out themselves.
Right. So, thank you. And last but not least?
My name is Yaya Fanusi, and I want you to support me on this one to tell Trump. I've been telling him the last 2 years, suggesting to him that he launch his own cultural revolution to destroy the swamp. So please support it.
Okay, thank you. All right. So let's go down the row here, and then we'll have to conclude and we'll have a break. So Mike Desch, please.
I mean, the human costs of our efforts to save the world and bring them the benefits of the American way of life are really astronomical. And certainly in terms of the moral calculus favoring restraint, they should be on the table. But I'm a realist, and politically, I think that in terms of mobilizing the American public to change, the default American grand strategy, that's not going to be a winning argument. That the winning argument is going to be American bodies and American national interest.
Monica?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And so the moral impact is the one that struck me. And I'm blessed that I'm at a school where actually we have a lot of veterans who are participating in this study, and we also have 40% of our student body is international, and then many of them are coming out of the areas in which we are still targeting. One of my PhD students is from Afghanistan, and I talk with her regularly, and she has a big part in this project. So I think it's extraordinarily important. I agree with Mike. Unless the American public feels it personally, Andy in the first session talked about how to make it so the Americans actually feel this, some sort of national service. We're not going to have a draft again, but until the American public sees it, feels it, perhaps through the deficit, which is ballooning, I'm afraid that it's going to be quite difficult actually to get them to turn on this. I'm a little bit optimistic with data, but as Will challenged me, is that going to be enough? I don't know. I hope it's enough, but how's that? It's the piece that I'm trying to contribute.
I should have used Monica last because I love her optimism.
The only thing I would add in response to the question about, what's the exact number where the U.S. gets to play Superman and swoop in and save the world, I won't answer that question because that's not how you think about foreign policy. Yeah, okay, are you the chicken then, the chicken hawk, or not, since you're doing the cock-a-doodle-doo over here in the front row? The United States isn't a superhero, and our Marvel comic movies aren't real. Our role is not to save the world from all the bad things that can happen in it. It's to protect ourselves and our allies, and if a particular situation arises, we can have a conversation about whether we should intervene. But that isn't what foreign policy is about. It's a fantasy. It's a fantasy that's all about the Holocaust and imagining we're going to stop Holocausts from now on until the end of the world. That isn't how we should be thinking about foreign policy and prejudging questions like what is the exact number. Ask me when it's happening and then I'll answer.
Andy?
I'm still trying to figure out the reference to champagne corks popping. That went right past me. Let me, I'll make my concluding comment on the question that related to great power competition. It's happening. I mean, that competition is clearly underway. It's going to be an enormously complex competition. We chose to think of the Cold War as a bipolar competition. That was maybe a helpful oversimplification, but it was an oversimplification. Clearly, we're moving into a multipolar world where we are going to have competitors and we're going to have nations or groups of nations that think the way we do. And one of the great challenges of our century is going to be to try to manage that competition so that it doesn't end up in the kind of catastrophes of the previous century when we had two terrible world wars. And to me, the beginning of wisdom there, as we think about the emerging great power competition, is to push back against the notion that the Cold War is the comparison. That between the United States and China, for example, that we are embarked upon a new Cold War, and that provides a paradigm to think about where we're going. I think that would be extraordinarily dangerous to us and to the rest of the world. So, it's going to require some imaginative thinking about what this great power competition is like. And needless to say, I urge you to consider the possibility that when you're looking for insight on that issue, that you will come to the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Thank
So-
you very much.
Yeah. So I want to thank our audience. Let's give them a round of applause, or our panel. And thank you for the questions. I think this shows the kind of energy around these subjects. And have a great conference, because I think we have some great performers up next.